Clint Eastwood is one of the last men alive who remembers Hollywood before it became what it is today. He was there when films were shot on dusty backlots with no money and no guarantees. He built himself from nothing in an era that rewarded exactly that, and he is still standing, long after the world made him completely disappeared. For 7 decades, he was Hollywood's definition of control, a man who directed his own films, chose his own roles, answered to no one, and built a legend so large that his name alone was enough to sell a movie anywhere on earth. But here is what that legend was built on top of. A daughter he didn't know existed for 64 years. Another daughter hidden for decades, born while he was still engaged to his first wife. And a woman he loved in the final chapter of his life who died suddenly at 61, leaving him alone at 93 with nothing but silence and a grief he never prepared for. The world thinks it knows Clint Eastwood, the tough guy, the director, the icon. But the story who he actually is, the father who wasn't there, the man who kept impossible secrets, and the 96-year-old who now sits alone in a house full of photographs, that story is something else entirely. This is the one Hollywood never told you. Clint Eastwood Jr. was born on May 31st, 1930 in San Francisco, California. His father, Clinton Sr., was a steelworker, quiet, hardworking, always moving. The family followed his jobs from city to city during the Great Depression, packing up and starting over so many times that young Clint attended 11 different schools before he graduated. He was tall for his age, withdrawn, the kind of boy who watched more than he spoke. He was not a natural student, he was not a natural socializer, but he could fix a car engine before most boys his age could ride a bicycle. And he had a physical confidence, a stillness, that made people notice him even when he wasn't doing anything at all. After high school, he drifted, lodging, steel furnaces, military service during the Korean War era, stationed in Fort Ord in California, a posting that never sent him overseas, but gave him 2 years of enforced patience that suited him better than school ever had. It was at Fort Ord that the director spotted him. By 1954, Clint Eastwood had his first small film contract. He was 23 years old. He was engaged to a woman named Maggie Johnson, a model he had met at a party. The wedding was already being planned. And somewhere in California, a woman he had been involved with before Maggie, a woman whose name he would not speak publicly for decades, had just discovered she was pregnant. She never told him. She made that decision alone, in silence, and the baby was placed for adoption. Clint Eastwood walked down the aisle with Maggie Johnson in December 1953, completely unaware that somewhere out there a daughter of his had already been born. Her name was Laurie, and she would spend the next 64 years trying to find out who her father was. What happened to Clint Eastwood's career between 1958 and 1968 is one of the most unlikely transformations in Hollywood history. He spent years going nowhere, bit parts, forgotten TV appearances, the kind of slow grind that breaks most people inside a decade. Then came a television western called Rawhide, and suddenly America knew his face. But it was Italy that made him a legend. Sergio Leone, an Italian director with an obsessive vision of the American West, cast Eastwood in a trilogy of films that rewrote the rules of the genre entirely. A fistful of dollars, for a few dollars more, the good, the bad, and the ugly. In all three, Eastwood played a character with no name, no backstory, no explanation, just a hat, a poncho, a cheroot, and eyes that said everything the script didn't. The world had never seen anything like it. By the time he returned to America, he wasn't just a movie star. He was an archetype, a myth, the template for what a certain kind of American masculinity was supposed to look like. Dirty Harry in 1971 made it permanent. And then, because Clint Eastwood was never content to simply perform, he began directing. Play Misty for Me, The Outlaw Josie Wales, Unforgiven. The latter won him an Academy Award for Best Director and Best Picture in 1992. He was 61 years old when he won that Oscar. He had been working for 40 years to earn it. He stood on that stage and looked exactly like a man who had never doubted this moment would come. But backstage, in the parts of his life the cameras didn't reach, the debts he had been quietly accumulating for decades were about to come due. Clint Eastwood and Maggie Johnson were married for 31 years. On paper, it was a long marriage, but any other measure, it was a complicated one. During the 1950s and 1960s, while Clint was becoming famous, while Rawhide was running, while Leone films were being made, he was also conducting a relationship that Maggie knew nothing about. Her name was Roxanne Tunis. She was a stuntwoman and actress, and her affair with Clint Eastwood lasted 14 years. In 1964, while Clint was still married to Maggie, Roxanne gave birth to a daughter, a girl named Kimber. For years, Kimber's existence was kept completely quiet. No announcement, no acknowledgement. A child who grew up knowing who her father was, but who the rest of the world was not supposed to know about. It was only later, after the marriage to Maggie had ended, after other relationships had come and gone, that Clint Eastwood publicly acknowledged Kimber as his daughter. By then, she was already an adult. That is, two daughters, one hidden during his engagement, one hidden during his marriage. But the third secret was the one that even Clint himself didn't know. Somewhere in California, a woman named Lori Marie had spent most of her adult life carrying a question she couldn't answer. She had been adopted as an infant. She knew almost nothing about where she came from. For years, through adolescence, through raising her own family, through decades of dead ends, she searched for her biological parents. Then slowly the pieces began to come together. The dates matched, the geography matched, and then confirmed through the kind of meticulous genealogical research that takes years. The name emerged. Her biological father was Clint Eastwood. Think about what that moment must have felt like. You have spent your entire life as someone whose origins were a blank space. And then one day, the blank space fills in with one of the most recognizable faces on earth. Lori was in her 60s by the time the truth was fully confirmed. Clint Eastwood was in his 80s when contact was eventually made and the story became public. Those close to both said the same thing, that neither of them had known. The woman who gave Lori up for adoption had made her decision alone in 1954 and had carried the secret until her death. She never told Clint, she never told Lori who her father was. Two people 64 years apart, both living complete lives, building complete identities, and neither of them knowing the other existed. Clint Eastwood had spent decades projecting the image of a man who was in control of everything. His career, his films, his silence. And somewhere out there, for all those decades, a daughter of his had been growing up, growing old, searching, and he never knew. After his divorce from Maggie Johnson in 1984, Clint Eastwood moved through relationships the way he moved through films, intensely, completely, and then on to the next. Sandra Locke, an actress, was with him for 14 years. Their relationship ended bitterly. A lawsuit, accusations of cruelty, a legal settlement. Locke later wrote a book about their time together that painted a picture of a man who could be warm and generous one moment and completely cold the next. Then came Dinah Ruiz, a television journalist who was more than 35 years younger than him. They married in 1996 and had a daughter together, Morgan. That marriage lasted 17 years before quietly dissolving. In between and around all of this, the marriages, the long relationships, the children acknowledged and unacknowledged, Clint Eastwood never seemed to stop working. Film after film, award after award, as if the work was the one thing that remained constant while everything else shifted around it. He fathered at least 8 children throughout his lifetime. Some grew up knowing him well, others barely knew him at all. And then, late in his life, he found something that seemed for the first time genuinely quiet. Her name was Christina Sandra. Christina was not a film star. She was not an actress. She was a restaurant hostess at a hotel where Clint was a regular, calm, private, with no interest in the spotlight that had followed him everywhere for 60 years. They had been together for nearly a decade. Those close to them described the relationship as the most settled, the most genuinely peaceful of Clint's life. No drama, no headlines, just two people living quietly in a way that suited both. In June 2024, Christina Sandra died suddenly. She was 61 years old. No long illness, no warning, just gone. Clint Eastwood's representative released a single statement. Clint Eastwood is mourning the loss of his girlfriend Christina Sandra. She was a lovely, caring woman, and he will miss her deeply. He was 93 years old when she died. Think about what that means, to be 93 and to have built finally something quiet and good, and then to have it taken without notice. He had outlived the era he defined. He had outlived rivals, critics, co-stars, directors who discovered him, and now he had outlived the woman who had given his final chapter its peace. At 94, Clint Eastwood still gets up early, he still works. There are reports of projects in development, scripts being read, the same discipline that has driven him since Fort Odd refusing to let go entirely. But the house is quieter now. The daughter he never knew, Lori, is part of his life. The daughter hidden during his marriage, Kimber, has built a life of her own. The children from his marriages, The ones who grew up with a father who was more icon than presence have their own stories of who he was and wasn't. What Clint Eastwood built over 94 years is extraordinary by any measure. A career spanning 7 decades, films that will be watched long after everyone who made them is gone. A name that becomes something larger than a person, an idea, a posture, a way of facing the world. But the real story, the daughter born before his wedding who found him 64 years later, the child hidden inside his marriage for decades, the woman who gave his last years gentleness and then left without warning, that story is quieter than any of the films. And in some ways more honest. The man who made a career out of saying almost nothing, who built a legend on silence and stillness and the suggestion of something held just below the surface, turns out to have been holding more than anyone knew. He always was.